This is week 4 of How to Be a Disciple, and this is part 2 of week 4. This is our last time for this series. And so we've been looking in this series in the Gospel of Mark, and I just wanted to recap and to highlight a little bit in this section because the final passage we're going to read today, the healing of blind Bartimaeus, is a passage that kind of requires us to understand the rest of the context, the rest of what was happening before this. So we're just going to hop back in our series and kind of highlight some of the things that we've been talking about, and then that'll help us to understand this healing story that we're going to read today. So back in week 1, we talked about this healing of a blind man where Jesus touches this man's eyes and he can't see completely. His vision's a little cloudy, and then he touches him again and then he can see fully again. So our first week in this, we looked at to be a disciple, you have to see clearly. You have to understand who Jesus is. A disciple is a person that's under a teacher. It is a student. It is a follower. And so if Jesus is our leader, we have to understand who he is. We have to see clearly who he is. And that healing story of that blind man really helps us to understand the healing story of the blind man we're going to talk about today. In week 2, we looked at the transfiguration where Jesus takes a few of his disciples up on this mountain, and we see God speaking from the clouds, and God says, "This is my dearly loved son, listen to him." That's in Mark 9, verse 7. And just after that, we see this encounter with Jesus and a father whose son was unable to be healed by the disciples, and he says, "Jesus, I believe that you can do this, but help me overcome my unbelief." And so in week 2, we really focused on belief. In that being a disciple, you have to believe. You have to understand who Jesus is. You have to believe him. You have to live out his values. In week 3, we really focused on Jesus and how he was treating people. And we see the disciples wanting to be great. We see the disciples arguing about who's the greatest among them. We see them wanting to sit at the best seat next to Jesus in heaven. We see them turn children away. We see them telling parents to keep their children away from Jesus. And we see Jesus showing the disciples with children, showing the disciples with how he interacts with these blind men, how to treat others. We see that to be a disciple, you have to put others first. You have to look after others. You have to be a servant of others. And so today we're gonna pick up in Mark 10:46 through 52. So if you have your Bibles, you can open those up. And so this little passage really kind of requires us to understand the rest of it to be able to fully understand this passage that we're about to read. Mark 10:46. Then they reached Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples left town, a large crowd followed him. A blind beggar named Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, was sitting beside the road. And when Bartimaeus heard that Jesus of Nazareth was nearby, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." "Be quiet," many of the people yelled at him, but he only shouted louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." When Jesus heard him, he stopped and said, "Tell him to come here." So they called the blind man. "Cheer up," they said. "Come on, he's calling you." Bartimaeus threw aside his coat. He jumped up and he came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. "My rabbi," the blind man said, "I want to see." And Jesus said to him, "Go, for your faith has healed you." And instantly the man could see, and he followed Jesus down the road. So this passage is what we're going to focus on today. And our main point today is this. To be a disciple, you have to follow. To be a disciple of Jesus, you have to follow. We've been talking about all along that disciple is just a fancy church word of saying follower, of saying somebody that is under a leader. And so here we see that Bartimaeus, we'll call him Bart, he shows us how to follow. And when we look at this passage, we kind of see how everything ties together. For Bart shows us how to see. Remember the first healing of the first blind man. Bartimaeus shows us how to see. He calls Jesus, he calls out and he says, "Son of David." And the reason this is important is because it was a messianic title. It was something that was used in the Old Testament. It was significant because it was used multiple times in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, and the Psalms. It was used as a title of the Messiah. And so when Bartimaeus says this, when he says "Son of David," he is showing that he understands who Jesus is. He is showing that he must have heard some of his teachings. He's showing that he knows who Jesus is. Remember, we know that Peter responds to Jesus this way in that first question that Jesus asked his disciples. We talked about that in week 1. He says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter replies, "Jesus, you're the Messiah." We see how Peter kind of fails a little bit after that. But Bart shows us that he sees who Jesus is. He calls him rabbi. He calls him son of David. He understands who Jesus is. Maybe he didn't fully know, but we see him saying this to Jesus, calling Jesus this. And we see that that would be a reminder to the disciples that they have to see who Jesus is. We see that Bart shows us how to follow Jesus. We see that he's teaching the disciples. He's a reminder to the disciples of what it means to follow. For it isn't just enough to see who Jesus is. You have to follow him. And you have to live up to his values. You know, it's not just enough to say, Jesus, you're the Messiah, but then you can't stand in the way of what Jesus came to do. You have to value the things that Jesus values and treat people the way that Jesus treated them. You know, when we look at this passage, we see that Bart, he drops everything to follow Jesus. He drops his cloak. And as a beggar, that's everything that he would have. He dropped his coat on the side of the road. And remember, in part one of this section, we talked about how Peter had said, Jesus, we've dropped everything to follow you. Well, here, Bart is just another reminder to the disciples of what it means to follow. You know, what happens at the end of this story is kind of interesting because, you know, it says here at the end of Bart's healing, it says, instantly the man could see and he followed Jesus down the road. In the healing of the blind man in Mark 8:22, Jesus sends him home. When Jesus heals other people elsewhere in Scripture, he often will send them home. Here, Bart follows Jesus down the road. You know, and I think the reason for that is I think that, you know, Bart was being used by Jesus, in a good sense of the way. Bart was being used to show Jesus' disciples, to remind Jesus' disciples of what it means to follow. I think he was a good reminder of when the disciples had dropped everything to follow Jesus. He was reminding them of what it means to follow. So he follows. You know, and I think Bart is this kind of really good example. We talked about, you know, him dropping his coat to follow Jesus. And I think that, you know, when you have nothing, when you have just a little bit, it might seem a little bit easier to drop all that you have. Remember in part one, we talked about the rich young man not being able to sell his possessions to follow. Bart has nothing but a coat, and he drops it and he follows Jesus. You see that Jesus is teaching his disciples along the way as they travel. All of this is tied together. You know, to follow Jesus, you have to give up everything to follow him. You have to be a servant of others. You have to treat others as Jesus treated them, not as the world treats them. So you can't be like the disciples and try to keep people like the children away from Jesus. We have to treat others as Jesus would treat them. Being a disciple means learning from Jesus every single day. It means valuing the things that he values. Bart is one modeling for the disciples of what it means to follow. He was a reminder to them of giving up everything to follow. He was an encouragement to them. He was a reminder that though they may have messed up and maybe not followed Jesus every day in every way, he was a reminder that all they have to do is just get back and to follow Jesus. So are you ready to be a disciple? Are you ready to follow? It means that we can't say, hey, Jesus, you're the Messiah, you're Lord of my life, and then go and live a different way. When we say, Jesus, you're the Messiah, we have to understand that as a disciple, we are making Jesus our leader. So we have to follow him in every area of our life. You know, we can't stand in the way of the mission of Jesus. We have to treat people like Jesus treated them. We have to value the things that Jesus values. We have to understand that we have to love Jesus first, and we can't love anything else more. We can't put money first. We can't put success or fame or fortune or relationships first. We have to put Jesus first. And it's step by step. It's day by day when we are trying to follow Jesus. You know, we might fail. We might mess up. But what we see in this story is, I think, you know, Bartimaeus was a good example for the disciples. He was a reminder to the disciples that, you know, there might be a time when you're not seeing clearly, but all you have to do is just drop everything again and follow Jesus. You know, Bart is the story. We see it, and I think we kind of need to read this whole section together. We need to be able to understand these 6 or 7 verses. We have to kind of see it all tying together, because Jesus was teaching his disciples as they traveled along the road. He was teaching his disciples as they traveled. And we have to understand that, you know, For us, we need to be learning from Jesus every single day. We need to be learning as we go about. And there's going to be times we fail, but we just have to return to Jesus and follow him. We have to understand that Jesus has grace and forgiveness and that he wants us to follow. So when we mess up, turn right back to Jesus. Don't just keep going your own way. So, are you ready to be a disciple? Are you ready to follow? Are you ready to drop everything and follow him?